The two marsh folk had lived quiet, solitary lives on the opposite sides of the swamp, one a little south from the Cranemere pool, the other on its northern shore. Therefore, despite having been relative neighbours, they had not had many chances to bump into one another, and had been completely unaware of each other's existence. But one momentous day, all that was to change. They were both attracted by the lights in the dell. Miss Twisp was playing with her fog dog, throwing balls of light for him to fetch. Fog dog lolloped about in their pursuit, changing his size and leaping high into the air as he tried to swallow them up before they descended. When he had consumed a sufficient amount, he gambolled back to Miss Twisp, panting happily. But the balls of light escaped through his open mouth and danced around them both, and Fog Dog excitedly jumped after them again. This frolicsome activity was performed in complete silence. Suddenly, the silence was disrupted by the squelching sounds of soggy sap tramping through the shallow waters covered in duckweed. His spirits were bright, and so were his large green feet, flat and unshod and webbed, but not quite so broad at the toes as those of a frog. He stopped, and amused by the antics of Fog Dog, peered at the scene through the willows, and then he too heard squelchy sounds. Soggy Sap turned around, and there she stood, right before him, in all her rotund glory. He gasped. He had never even seen another marsh folk in these parts, let alone such a beauty. In fact, she looked very much like him, and now she looked very much at him too. Her moon-like face was tinged with green and moistened with beads of swamp dew, remarkably resembling his own. Both exuded the placidity of their nature, and were to one another the veritable pinnacles of palustral perfection. And so it followed that the mutual attraction that they had both felt immediately, in no time at all had blossomed into the full-blown love at first sight. However, being bog inhabitants, their characters were unaccustomed to haste. Rushing things went strictly against their temperament, therefore everything had to be done properly, according to the marsh folk courtship etiquette. That is why, on the first day, they just looked at one another. Although they both knew there and then that they were to pass the eternity in blissful union, they just took turns at staring at each other. First, not blinking, then blinking, turning away and turning around, striking magnificent poses to ensure that the observation would be complete and no part of their beloved's heart was left unconquered. So ended their first meeting. The next day they decided to take things one step further. Pacing in circles, measuredly and with the strictest of regularities, they would change their direction in unison, but always keeping the same distance. The third day saw some real progress. Although still moving in the same circular fashion, one would try to catch up with the other. Since it was she who had started the chase, it was a great encouragement to the object of her desire, who, mesmerized by this vision of unrivalled swamp elegance, quickly, if that is the right word to describe it, followed suit. The fourth meeting went thus. After completing a couple of rounds, she, who at that time was being pursued, stopped and turned around to face him, and they remained like that for some while, gazing into each other's protruding, glistening eyes, intoxicated by this sudden development. Then he squatted, gathered a huge wad of duckweed, and planted it on top of her head. She stood there, seductively bubbling at her mouth as the swamp water trickled down her chins. Next it was her turn, and with great solemnity she crowned him with an even larger tangle of marsh vegetation, after which they again needed to take some time to assimilate all that was happening. At last, simultaneously, they tumbled side by side down into the shallow waters and began splashing about in transports of ecstasy. It was indeed such a superb spectacle, and it had so greatly impressed the local water voles, that at once, and with all the due decorum, they had announced a sunset celebration in their honour, and even the busy beaver folk who were constructing a new dam nearby had paused their work to admire the romantic couple. Eventually, upon having determined that they had had enough of the pre-connubial procedure, they resumed their verticality, however slight, and, grabbing hold of one another, gurgled with the slow drawl which is peculiar to all marsh folk.
"Oh, soggy! Oh, quaggy!"
They tried to entwine their bodies and limbs around the object of their passion. However, being nearly spherical, it had proved to be somewhat of a challenge. Undaunted at first, they persevered for a while until, contented to hold hands, they departed in search of a suitable dwelling. They came upon a deserted hut, and with the help of the beaver folk had positioned it onto a platform, creating a fairly serviceable floating bog house that could be moved about the shallow marsh waters. While contemplating where to spend their honeymoon, they were visited by a passing water sprite who recommended an exceptionally desirable property, which prior to their removal to the coast had been the abode of his family. Located just south of the Ferndale, it was a large disused well in the Craddock on the island of the Eye of Twill. Up the river Twill they went, and they were so satisfied with their lodgings that when Quaggy was expecting to deliver their long-awaited child, they agreed that this gladsome event should take place on the site of their amorous escapades. And that is where Wellnell was born. That happened about 2 summers ago.